Welcome to The Reset, a weekly dispatch of experiences and takes on performance and modern care. For the athlete, the practitioner, and the thinker, we break down recovery, health, and performance systems to reshape the conversation around wellness. Hello everybody, and welcome to The Reset. This week's episode will be talking about adaptation intelligence to physical stress. We will examine compensation and adaptation to movement in less than ideal situations, and how the body's many systems showcase their intelligence in adapting and negotiating with stress to create a more optimal environment to move within. Enjoy! The Reset, Episode 29. Adaptation intelligence to physical stress. How smart compensation can really be, and why the optimal path to pain-free movement is typically the existing one without its current limitations. Intro. Adaptation. The learned practice of reorganizing and reacting to external and internal circumstances. I think it's pertinent to state that this process is not the same for everyone. In fact, though the patterns are limited by the human body and the fact that we can only produce a certain amount of movement patterns with what we're all given, we cannot express the same pattern the same way every time, nor can we expect that those patterns are the same from person to person. This is due to the slight nuances and novelties each of us has the potential to obtain and develop through our own lives. It's all very specific to our own experiences. Through our own movement practices and history of injury or physical development, we all have the potential to produce adaptations to each circumstance we face. Now, in this light, I typically will see adaptations occur in regards to pain and movement dysfunction, and are inherently negative in their outcomes. Otherwise, I wouldn't be seeing them for assistance in fixing these problems in the first place. That said, there are adaptations that occur regularly to produce a positive improvement. These are the adaptations that we seek out regularly when we train, when we rehab, or recover. I want to dive into these examples with a little more direction today, showcasing the intelligence behind any adaptation and how we can turn a negative reaction to stimulus into a positive one. In order to do this, we must first understand the differences between adaptations and what makes them smart. Compensation. Compensation sits at the forefront of my business, as an alternative to what is either expected or normal. It renders a second, third, or even fourth option towards the overall goal of movement that is in the process of being achieved. For example, we can use someone picking something off the floor. I'll break this down. The movement. Using a simple movement of bending over to pick something off the floor. The optimal action in that movement is when we look at it, we simply see someone attempting to bring their upper trunk closer towards the floor to pick something up using their hands. This requires a few things to happen, but for example's sake, we'll focus on the hips and the knees. Initiated movement at the hip into a flexed position, and slight bending of the knee to allow for further range of motion must occur to fold the body safely towards the ground. The common limitation in this movement, the posterior chain in general, or more specifically the hamstrings, can pose a tension limitation, and this is what we usually see, which causes a tight feeling or sometimes pain in the movement in the hamstring, knee, or hip. The compensation, the hips disengage to prevent further hamstring stretch and potentially pain, and the spine, more specifically the low back or lumbar spine, in order to produce the movement fully. Now, the above example can look extreme in some people, where we see full rounding of the back and fairly straight legs. Sometimes this is a movement pattern fault, i.e. the person doesn't understand where they're getting their range of motion from and have zero awareness of how they're moving in general. And sometimes it's not so noticeable. These insidious circumstances produce a slow burn injury to occur, where the pattern looks a little bit like the one I mentioned above, but just enough of a compensatory movement to cause small stress increases on the low back and over time have a larger effect. Now, compensation isn't inherently terrible all the time. For certain cases, it's not only okay, but necessary. Sometimes compensation can stave off injury, allowing for a full movement pattern to occur when only room for a half one was present. A healthy compensation like this is dependent on the amount of times it occurs and the intensity at which it occurs in. If utilized too often, the compensatory pattern can become the new stock pattern for that movement. This is where the breakdown can occur. And this is where compensatory and faulty movement patterns often start as smart solutions. Understanding this possibility can help provide careful feedback to the process of changing it and correcting it over a long period of time for the better. Adaptation intelligence. In a moment's decision, the brain decides what to prioritize. It is a split-second decision that we don't even realize or think about consciously. In that moment, that decision occurs beyond thought, and for a good reason. Reflexes and feedback loops in the spinal cord are responsible for keeping us safe. If it feels there is an unorganized or unresponsive kink in the chain of movement, it will create a new one. The example I tend to use regarding this phenomenon uses a person riding their bike on a trail. There is already a clear-cut path carved into the hardened dirt from all the previous rides down this path we've taken. This would be your stock movement pattern. The same turns and straights we've experienced hundreds or thousands of times before, except this time, there's a rock embedded right in the middle of the path. Now, we can blast through this, completely disregarding the barrier to the endpoint, or we can create a divergent path next to it. This divergence can prevent serious damage, and perhaps complete failure. But there are two problems with continuous use of this new path. Firstly, the new path ignores fully the existing one, which has years of practice and has quite literally evolved with the body that performs it. And secondly, the barrier to the optimal path, aka the original path, is still present. For context, the barrier could be anything, from an underdeveloped muscle within a system of muscles that perform a movement pattern or an inflammatory response around a branch of motor nerves that are responsible for sending signals to the muscles in order for them to move. Either way, if that barrier doesn't get dealt with, movement occurring within that system always has the potential to become a divergent compensatory movement when it is unnecessary to do so long term. Negotiating with stress. In this case, we are speaking about physical stress. Physical stress shows in many ways and is always up for interpretation by the human experiencing it. The same stimulus that feels manageable to one person can feel overwhelming to another, even when it looks identical on paper. From a biological standpoint, stress is simply information. Mechanical load applied to tissue. Neurological demand placed on a system. Metabolic cost incurred to produce movement. The body does not categorize stress as good or bad. It categorizes it as tolerable or intolerable. This is where load tolerance comes into play. Every tissue in the body, muscle, tendon, bone, nerve, has a capacity to accept load. When stress is applied within that capacity, the body responds by adapting. Muscle fibers thicken, tendons stiffen and organize, bones increase their density, and neural pathways become more efficient. This is the basis of training, rehab, and recovery alike. Apply stress, recover, and then adapt. But when stress exceeds current tolerance, either in magnitude, frequency, or duration, the system looks for alternatives. Pain, inhibition, and compensation emerge not as failures, but as negotiations. The body is saying, this input is too expensive right now, and we need another solution. This negotiation is heavily influenced by the nervous system. Research in neuroplasticity shows us that the brain is constantly updating its internal maps based on perceived safety and threat. When a movement, position, or load is repeatedly associated with discomfort or uncertainty, the brain will often downregulate output to the tissues involved. Strength appears to disappear. Range of motion feels limited, and coordination degrades. Not because the tissue is incapable, but because the system is protecting itself. And this is where plasticity becomes relevant. Plasticity is the nervous system's ability to rewire itself through repetition, novelty, and safety. Repeated exposure to tolerable stress, not excessive stress, allows the brain to reassess threat. Over time, movements that once felt risky to begin feel predictable again. Muscles fire sooner. Force production improves. The original optimal pathway becomes available once again. This is also why simply avoiding stress rarely solves a problem long term. Without exposure, tolerance does not increase. The barrier in the path remains, and the divergent trail becomes more and more established. Strategic exposure, on the other hand, allows us to negotiate with stress rather than fear it. We meet the body where it is, apply just enough challenge to signal adaptation, and allow recovery to do the rest. In this sense, stress is not something to eliminate, but something to dose appropriately. Closing. The smarter path forward. Adaptation is not random. Compensation is not careless. And stress is not the enemy. Each of these processes reflects a system that is deeply intelligent, one that is constantly balancing survival, efficiency, and performance based on the information it receives. When we understand this, our role shifts. We stop forcing change and we begin guiding it. By addressing barriers rather than bypassing them, by respecting load tolerance rather than exceeding it, and by using exposure to restore confidence rather than avoidance to seek comfort, we then allow the body to return to its most efficient solutions. My overall view on adaptation and compensation to a non-optimal situation is this. The original path cannot be abandoned, especially in later stages of life, and we should maintain focus on creating a series of interventions and strategies around making the path accessible again, but in an optimal way. Smart adaptation is not about pushing harder, it's about listening more carefully. And when we do that, the body usually tells us exactly how to move forward. In health and performance, Alex.